The first thing you notice is the sound. A faucet that was off, dripping. A door settling after you locked it. The hiss of a neighbor's TV, thin through drywall, cutting off exactly when you mute yours. Then the second thing, eyes you never see, but always feel, learning your schedule the way a predator learns a trail. You aren't alone in your home. This is Mr. BlackWhisper. I moved into the basement unit in late winter, when the sidewalks were a hard gray and the air sounded hollow. Cheap place. Long, narrow room. A low ceiling with vents that breathed like something sleeping. The neighbor upstairs paced in a slow rectangle every night. Not loud, just measured, like footsteps on an old metronome. It made the place feel lived in. That felt safer at first. He and I shared a laundry room at the back of the building. I only ever saw him once. A thin man with a cardigan stretched off one shoulder as he carried out a bag of lint and threads like it was evidence. He had a careful way of looking at things, eyes never quite on your face, always grazing past it, as if he wanted to memorize your outline without touching you with focus. He said the dryer ate socks and chuckled in a way that didn't rise into his eyes. I laughed back because not laughing felt rude. At night, the pacing upstairs would begin. It eventually lined up with my life. Footsteps when I shut off the kitchen light. A pause over the corner where my bed sat, just a few feet below the floorboards. Another pause when I brushed my teeth. Odd, because that sink didn't sit below his bathroom. I told myself sound behaves strangely in old buildings, like a cat slipping through vents you didn't know existed. I left habits in the open, keys on the counter, hairbrush by the mirror, a cheap clock facing my bed. The clock ticked with a noise that felt too loud for its size. It started to skip some nights, then speed up for a stretch, like a heart bothered by bad dreams. I replaced the battery twice. It kept happening. I blamed the winter dryness, static in the air, the kinds of excuses you can say aloud while avoiding the thing your stomach already knows. First small wrong thing. My toothbrush was damp when I returned from a weekend shift, even though I'd wrapped it in a drawer with rubber bands. Second thing, someone had pressed their fingertips along the top edge of the bathroom mirror, oily crescents in a neat row. I wiped them, then stared at the clean glass until my face looked like a stranger's. The vents were old metal grills painted over too many times. One sat low along the baseboard near the foot of my bed. It drafted cold air at night that tasted faintly sour, like breath through cloth. I started sleeping with the vent blocked by a towel. And that's when the pacing upstairs moved closer, a slower rhythm right above my pillow. The ceiling creaked in a circle as if someone had rotated their weight on a single foot. The towel slipped open around 3 in the morning. Not once, not twice, but for 3 nights. Like it had changed its mind mid-sleep. I taped it. The tape peeled back later with patience. Not torn strands, but clean lift, as if a careful fingernail had coaxed it free. I told the landlord I thought there was a draft problem and asked if someone had done maintenance. He said nobody had a reason to enter. He laughed about how buildings know our heat and hunger and learn to groan like us. He said the man upstairs was quiet, the kind you never have trouble with. He said it like a compliment and a warning folded into one sentence. When I lay still, I could feel exactly where he stood above me. Not with my ears, with the soft place below the ribs that knows when a hawk glides over a field. I brought home a small mirror, the cheap kind college students stick to walls. I placed it on the floor, propped to catch the vent's mouth. The metal slats distorted my reflection into narrow slices. I waited in the dim and let the apartment get very still. The upstairs TV whispered and cut off. The footsteps aligned with my breathing. I heard his weight stop above the bed. There. A soft bump from inside the vent, not the ductwork settling, but a finger's nudge. Then the slats shifted a fraction, just enough that a seam of darkness opened behind the grill, the kind of darkness that belongs to a room no one was supposed to enter. I held my breath until my chest felt hot. The seam widened. I realized the screws holding the vent were ruined, slotted heads stripped down to nothing, and the paint around them was smudged. The seam kept widening with those tiny patient nudges, and then something bright caught light inside. Not eyes, glass. I saw a circle, tiny and black at the center, ringed by the faint sheen of a lens. I heard a breath. Not mine. Everything afterward felt slow and precise. I slid off the bed, keeping my weight on the parts of the floor I knew from memory didn't complain. I walked out with my keys, phone, and coat. The hallway felt wider than usual. I could hear someone upstairs walking toward the back stairs, matching me step for step. Outside, they paused as I did at the top of the basement stairwell. The cold bit into the soft of my throat. I walked to my car. The footsteps upstairs returned to pacing. The police came with practiced politeness and a pen ready for reasons not to escalate. They knocked on his door. He opened. They asked if he'd been in the basement. He said he hardly left his place. They looked at the vent and told me we live in a world where cheap cameras are smaller than a coin, where anyone could slip anything anywhere, where proof matters more than dread. They wrote a report down like water poured into a trench. I stayed with a friend 2 nights. On the 3rd, I returned to pack. The landlord stood by the laundry door, scratching at lint on his sleeve, asking if there was anything he could do to make this right. I said not to worry. He said the man upstairs seemed unsettled that I was leaving so soon. He said the man had asked if he could take over the basement lease if I broke it early. He said the man liked the quiet down there. When I went back to the room for the last box, I saw the mirror still propped on the floor. The vent's grill sat properly in place, paint perfect, new screws with crisp heads and a hint of metal filings like dust beneath. The towel I had taped hung neatly folded on the chair by the mirror. You learn, in a moment like that, the difference between something strange and something specific. The difference is that something specific knows your name. I left the mirror behind. I didn't want to see myself in that room anymore. The thin reflection that had taught somebody my schedule. I turned off the light and closed the door. As it latched, a sound came from the vent, so soft you could almost mistake it for the building's breath. A slow, steady inhale. He never knocked. He never spoke. He never touched me in a way that would be visible. But he adjusted my life by a fraction each night until I lived braced around his pauses. And that is a kind of touching. And now you know the cold line I sleep beside. He memorized my breathing, and when he was done, he adjusted his to match mine. In the old building with the wide stairwells that trapped grocery store echoes, my neighbor in 2A introduced himself the very first night as the sort who liked to borrow small things. Coffee, salt, a lighter to relight a stove. It was a friendly announcement with its own rules hidden inside. He was short, careful on the edges, with a face that only looked at you in segments. The collarbone first, then the chin, then the lower eyelids, as if whole faces were too bright to stare at all at once. The first borrow was sugar. I gave him a jar with a lid and told him to keep it. I had another. He laughed like I'd made a joke, then returned the jar 7 days later with sugar level identical, save for one thumbprint sifting the surface into a crater. He said he didn't bake as much as he thought he would. He said it like an apology that didn't quite attach to anything. We began the neighbor dance. He knocked when I was home, but in the shower. He rang the bell when I was on calls. He caught me on the stairs with my earbuds in. Always small things. A dish, he said, belonged to him, left on my doormat with a note in pencil. Thanks again. But it wasn't my dish. The handwriting was tidy except for the hesitations between letters, as if each needed permission to sit next to the next. I started finding little rearrangements inside my apartment. A wooden spoon facing the opposite direction in the drawer. A coat hanger rotated hook in. A plant nudged 2 inches closer to light it couldn't reach. The difference between forgetting and finding is that forgetting asks you nothing, while finding requires you to explain. There was a key-shaped scratch on the lock plate the morning after I heard footsteps pause outside my door at 2:13 a.m. The hallway light burned out that week and stayed out. I bought a new deadbolt but didn't know how to install it. I watched a video and held the tools like someone learning a language on their tongue. He knocked 10 minutes into the project with a smile you'd give a child with scissors. He offered a proper drill. He said he'd be happy to help. I said I'd manage. He said he'd just hold the door steady so it wouldn't slam. He pressed the door with 2 fingers and watched me from close enough that I smelled something dry and warm on him, like a paper bag left on a heater. He asked if I traveled much. I said sometimes. He asked which days. I said I didn't know. He said he had plants that needed watering when he was away, and it would be nice to trade favors. He stared at my hand on the screwdriver, like it was a question. 2 weeks later, I returned from a Sunday shift to find my apartment a degree colder and cleaner. Not the kind of clean you do for yourself. The kind of clean someone does to see what you leave where when you think nobody will look. Every curtain pulled to a precise angle. The toothpaste flipped cap down. The bed made tighter than my hands would ever make it, my hamper tucked so that the wall scuffed in a new, gentle crescent. My phone was on my pillow. I had left it on the kitchen counter. The landlord had a spare key, of course. I asked if anyone had accessed mine. He frowned. He checked a small, important-looking binder. He said no, but the word came out the shape of maybe. He mentioned my neighbor in 2A was the kind of tenant who liked to be helpful around the building. Deliveries, signing for packages, keeping an eye. He meant it as praise and as a warning at the same time. That night I slept with the new deadbolt's idea of safety pressed against my back. Sometime after 3 I woke to a smell that didn't belong to the room. Something warm and sweet, like coffee that had cooled and cloth that had been worn by a body and then folded. I opened my eyes to the silhouette of the chair by the bedroom door, and in the dark it was almost a person, the way furniture can be. I stared until the edges turned back into wood and screws. In the morning, my toothbrush tasted like someone else's tap water. I set a cup at the edge of the bedroom door and propped a tissue behind it. The idea was childish and exact. If the door moved, the tissue would fall. If it fell, I would know which part of my fear had bones. I returned from work and found the tissue on the floor and the cup upright, an impossible precision with one answer. Someone had replaced it carefully after moving through. There was a mug on my bedside table, empty except for a ring of coffee so thin it dried into a brown map that looked like the outline of a country I'd never visit. My mug, cleaned, then placed to dry without water. My name on its underside written in marker from a moving day long ago. I didn't call the police. I called my father. He said to be kind but not foolish. He said to take photographs. He said to document, and then to choose which part of myself I wanted to protect most. You rarely get to protect all parts at once. At 3 the next morning, a soft scraping of metal found the keyhole. The new deadbolt gave a tiny click, as if considering a compromise. I sat in bed, still, holding nothing, the way a child holds breath to become invisible to a game. The handle turned. The door stopped at the chain. The person on the other side paused, their breath quiet and steady. The chain lifted against its screws as if the door were an ocean and the chain a dock rope. I said no words. There is a kind of silence that says everything. The pressure released, the door closed. A minute later, a knock, polite and small. I didn't move. Another knock, longer. The kind of knock people do when they try to resemble a friend. Morning light made the apartment look like itself again, which is cruel in its own way. I went to the peephole and saw the hallway empty, the carpet running away in both directions like sentences without periods. That evening, I placed a note on 2A's door. Please stop entering my apartment. If you need sugar, ask. He returned the note under my mat with a different pen and a different hand. I never have, but if you're worried, I can keep your spare key safe for you. People misplace things. I changed the locks again, this time with a locksmith who smelled like wet rope and understood how to make a door speak only one language. The locksmith found a second keyway hidden in the frame, a relic from an old lock system. He capped it with a blank that he tapped into place like a nail. The next morning, on my doormat, a single item from my bathroom, a bottle of my lotion, cap twisted off 2 turns, half empty in a way it hadn't been. The note beside it said, "Sorry, I thought this was mine." I moved out on a Wednesday. I did it without telling the landlord or the neighbor or the building, because sometimes leaving is a kind of surgery you do without anesthesia. As I carried the last box down the stairwell, I heard a door open on the 2nd floor. Footsteps stepped to the landing. The footsteps stopped, not calling my name, not making a sound. I drove away with the windows down, letting the air strip the apartment smell off my clothes. At a red light, I glanced at the passenger seat. On top of the box sat my mug. I had not packed it. It stared up with its ring of old coffee like a small, dark solar eclipse. I threw it away at the next station. I felt foolish doing it, like a person in a movie making symbolic gestures at real problems. But when I slept that night in a different city, I slept without the taste of someone else's water. I taped my toothbrush to the wall for a week after. I locked the door twice and once more from inside. The lesson is simple and hard to live with. Doors are agreements, not guarantees. He borrowed the shapes of my habits until they looked like his. He didn't want sugar. He wanted to learn the measurements of me. And the last thing he borrowed was the part of me that trusted a lock to be more than a suggestion. The cul-de-sac had a bend that kept our house outside the sightline of passing cars, tucked under 2 oaks that shed in long, thin confetti that sounded like rain when there wasn't tea any. Across from us, Mr. Klein maintained a lawn so trim it felt shaved. He wore a hat with a chin strap even without wind, and moved sprinklers like a chess player who knows you're watching. People said he used to work in city planning. He understood lines and where they should hold. He liked to watch the neighborhood at dusk. Binoculars raised, elbows tucked, he stood in his driveway with a stillness that belonged to someone tracking birds. Sometimes he waved without lowering the lenses. I waved back with the politeness you keep for people whose names you might need if an ambulance ever pulled up to their curb. He brought us mail twice by mistake. Our bank statements had been sorted into his box. He apologized the way certain men apologize, voice low, eyes going sideways, as if the apology were for an arrangement neither of you were quite qualified to understand. He said the postal service along our street could be better. He said he'd keep an eye out for future mistakes. He said it while sliding his thumb under the corner of an envelope as if testing the glue. My wife worked nights some weeks. On those days, the house had an echo that didn't belong. I would make boxed meals that steamed like breath and eat them in front of a muted TV. Mr. Klein's lamp across the street burned yellow with a soft pulse, the kind of bulb that hums and makes you think of libraries. He had a small radio sometimes, quiet enough to drift in and out of my head without language. Our doorbell camera captured little, mostly cats moving neighborhood maps with their shoulders and teens slicing past on skateboards like pressed wind. One night, though, I scrolled through the footage to find Mr. Klein in our driveway at 3:06 a.m., moving our garbage cans 6 inches to the left and then back, measuring something invisible with his feet. He leaned toward our garage door and listened. I told myself he was lonely. The cul-de-sac offered no good excuses for being where you shouldn't be except loneliness and mischief, and he was too old for one and too precise for the other. When my brother visited for a weekend, he stood at the picture window and watched Mr. Klein watch us. He laughed. He said every street has a neighbor who gathers people's lives like stamps. He said it like a joke you've grown out of being nervous about. I laughed and didn't feel older. The lights in our living room began to dim in perfect intervals. We replaced bulbs. We checked breakers. It kept happening. A gentle fade around 9, steady for a minute, then a return to normal. Once the TV flicked to black and came back to the same frame, as if it had closed its eyes in embarrassment. Mr. Klein's lamp hummed across the street, unwavering. I went to his door with a plate of cookies that we baked for the story of it. He answered on the second ring with that chin strap snug as if the house could tilt and he'd be ready. I said we'd had some electrical oddities and asked if he had too. He smiled with one side of his mouth and said, "Old trees do tricks with lines underground." He said he had surge protectors. He said he liked how our living room was arranged better this week. The couch made the TV look more anchored. He shouldn't have known we'd moved the couch. Later I discovered the ladder marks on the side of our house. 2 inverted parentheses pressed into dirt beneath the living room window. Leaves disturbed in straight cuts, not blown, not shuffled. Clean lines that said I stood here, I leaned there, I looked like this. I started closing the curtains before sunset, but one set was old and bent and never quite touched. Between the fabric edges, a strip of our life leaked out to the night. It felt like a plate set too close to the edge of a counter. Not falling, but available for it. Saturday afternoon, I saw his garage open for the first time. Inside, at the back, there was a room made of plywood and insulation, built like a fort a child decides not to grow out of. The door stood half ajar. I crossed the street, carrying the ghost of an excuse that died halfway across the asphalt. He turned from his workbench and saw me the way a fisherman sees a ripple. A change to be noted and kept. He waved me in. He told me he was reorganizing. He told me he admired how I stored my ladders on the wall instead of on the floor. He would have had to be in my garage to know that. Inside the plywood room was a layout that hit me in a place no one sees. He had taped a rectangle on the floor, the exact dimensions of our living room rug. On that rectangle, a thrift store couch, same color as ours. A coffee table the same height. A lamp in the same corner. On the walls, dozens of photographs taken at night through glass. Our living room from the picture window. My wife asleep on the couch with a book face down. Me scratching the spot behind my ear I scratch when I am thinking too hard about a simple thing. He watched my eyes travel, not ashamed, not proud, just curious how the body solves a problem it didn't know it had. He said he liked to plan. He said he was working on emergency response readiness, measuring sight lines and power drops. He said in a catastrophe, details save lives. He said it kindly, putting me on the side of safety in a conversation that had no safety left. I left and stood in my driveway until my hands stopped wanting to break something. I told the police. They sent an officer younger than my mailbox, polite and thin. He said nothing in the photos was obscene. He said taking pictures from a public place into a space visible from the street wasn't a tea against anything but taste. He said if we felt threatened, we could look into a restraining order. He said restraining orders are pieces of paper that work best when everybody believes in paper. We installed better blinds and an alarm that chimes when a door opens. We kept the chime on even when it annoyed us. Mr. Klein began waving at the blinds like they were a game he admired me for finally learning to play. He moved his lamp to the back of his house. The dimming at 9 stopped. Instead, the TV volume hiccuped at 9:03, stepping down, then up, then settling. It became background noise, like a leaky faucet you stop hearing while learning to sleep to it. He stopped moving the garbage cans. The ladder marks filled with rain, and then with leaves, and then were gone. The last time I saw him before we sold the house, we crossed at the mailbox. He asked if we were happy there. He asked like a man checking his measurements against the world. I said we were planning to move closer to family. He said that was wise. He said some neighborhoods are only safe if you understand how they work. We left in early spring, when the trees looked like arithmetic, all branches and no answers. I turned once in the car to look at the picture window and saw a shape on our couch that was no longer ours. Maybe it was a shadow, maybe memory, maybe a room across the street practicing one last time, with the precision of someone who loved the idea of our life more than we ever could living inside it. He never broke a lock. He never crossed a line that could be seen. He only studied until the line moved to let him through. And that is how he kept us. Not inside his house, but inside his measurements, where lives fit in the quiet, the way furniture fits a room. The wall between my bedroom and the neighboring studio was thinner than it looked. The building had tried to fix this with layers of paint instead of construction, so the plaster wore a glossy, thick sheen that reflected lamplight like skin after rain. I learned the neighbor's schedule by accident. A low television until midnight, then silence, then the sound of water in pipes. Then, at 3:17, a knock. It wasn't loud. 2 taps. A pause. 3. Then a long quiet, like someone remembering the next part. The first night, I sat up in bed and stared at the wall, as if staring could thicken it. The second night, I knocked back without meaning to. 2, then 3. A reflex. An old game you play when someone speaks in a rhythm your body already knows. The knocking patterns changed. Sometimes slow, sometimes a little urgent, always at 3:17. The number landed in my mouth like a coin I hadn't meant to taste. I tried earplugs. They muffled the world, but the knocks reached through the bone behind my ear. An odd thing. If I listened harder, they stopped. If I tried to ignore them, they returned. I asked around the hall. No one else heard anything. The woman across from me said the studio next to mine was rented by a quiet man who kept to himself and left early for work in a uniform that didn't belong to any brand she could name. She said he had that careful way of closing doors that means a person has lived near breakable things. I slid a note under his door. The knocks at 3:17 wake me. Could you move them earlier or later? The note came back under mine at noon. Sorry, I don't knock. I work nights. I get home at 4. The next morning, the knocking began at 3:17 again. This time, it came with a new element. A breath, not human exactly. A draft whispered through a narrow place. I pressed my palm to the wall. The paint felt colder where the sound seemed to live. I imagined the wall's interior, the narrow stud bay, the nest of wires braided like hair. The place where someone might put their ear to hear if they're alone. I placed a framed print on that section of wall, a cheap landscape that made the room feel like it had windows it didn't. The print shifted minutely at 3:17, as if wind had moved through. When I woke the next day, it hung a 1/4 inch out of level, the kind of small wrongness that lingers in peripheral vision, asking to be fixed, daring you to ask why it needs it. I took the frame down. Behind it, a circle of paint the size of a coin had blistered and popped. A pinhole in the plaster hid there so perfectly placed I might have thought a nail had once lived there if not for the tiny black speck inside the white. The black of a lens, the black of a hole that belongs to an eye even when an eye isn't there. I stood very still and whispered nothing, because sometimes nothing tells you more than sound. At 3:17 that night, the pattern started again. Softer, as if the wall was the one knocking. I placed my mouth to the hole and breathed out, steady and slow, then stopped. On the other side, a matching exhale answered, a copy of mine cut into the edges like a tracing. I felt lightheaded, not from lack of air, but from the feeling of being echoed by something that shouldn't be able to echo. I put an outlet plate over the hole the next day. The blank kind used to cover old sockets. The screws found wood too easily, like they'd been waiting. I ran my hand along the wall, and it hummed with the faintest vibration, a machine somewhere behind language measuring our quiet. I told the landlord. He said tenants complain about noise when the weather turns and walls change their mind about carrying sound. He said not to worry. He said the man in the studio was moving out soon anyway. He said he'd leave a note. The note he left came back under my door with my name misspelled and the letters neat like a school test. I don't knock. Please stop knocking back. I bought spackle and filled the hole behind the outlet. Small squeezes, smoothing with a fingertip, white on white. The sense of sealing a mouth that had learned my breath. That night, at 3:17, the wall knocked, and then the outlet whispered. Not a word, air moving where air shouldn't. The screws turned a degree on their own, and I understood the difference between covering and closing. I took the outlet off and peered through. On the other side, darkness and a shadow that wasn't mine. Then a smell, faint soap and something like leather left in sun. Then a whisper, very soft, a hum on the edges of speech rather than speech itself. the sort of sound you make when you practice a silence and then fail it by wanting too much. I said, "What do you want?" but not out loud, just lips forming shape. The air warmed and cooled twice, like laughter pressed into a wall. I set my phone to record overnight. In the morning, the file was there until it wasn't. A tiny corruption message. I recorded the next night with a different app. In the morning, the file was there and played nothing at all for an hour, just room tone. And then at 3:17, the sound of my own sleep breath, steady and slow. Then another breath carefully nested on top of mine, like a hand placed over a heartbeat and matched to it. Then a whisper that wasn't a word but was mine, looped and played back to me, then cut. I moved the bed to the opposite wall. I slept better for 2 nights. On the third, a knock from the new wall at 3:17. I went to the neighbor's door at noon. No one answered. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard nothing. The landlord's key opened it with a reluctance that said the door had learned to belong to the person inside. The studio was stripped, drawers open to show their emptiness. The kind of emptiness that staged for a landlord's camera, but not cleaned for a conscience. On the wall we shared was a grid of small holes, drilled and then filled, sanded soft. Near the floor, at outlet height, was a clean circle of untouched paint the size of a coin. Behind his outlet box lived a chamber carved carefully between studs, large enough for a face to approach. Taped to the inside with a neatness that felt like pride were strips of my life. A shopping list in my hand from a week I had meant to buy garlic and didn't eat. A photograph of me in bed from a bad angle that made my mouth look like a thin zero. A copy of my note. My handwriting scanned and reprinted my sentence loop broken, where a loop of my fear had snagged. I left without taking pictures. Sometimes a camera makes something too real to understand. I told the landlord he needed to patch with wood, not paint. He nodded the way people do when the world gives them a task they can afford to do halfway. I moved 2 months later, not because of the wall alone, but because once you teach your sleep to argue with a number, you need new walls to learn different arithmetic. The new place has thick plaster. The outlets sit higher. I sleep through the hour between 3 and 4 most nights. When I wake at 3:17, I put my palm against the wall and feel nothing but cool and the shape of my hand coming back to me. That should be enough. Last week, while unpacking, I found a folded piece of paper in the lining of a box I had bought used from a thrift store near my old building. Thin, neat letters. My name spelled wrong in the same exact way. Very polite, very specific. If you move, please send the new number. The wall I sleep beside now is quiet. I breathe, and it doesn't answer. Some nights, in the middle of the dark math, I press my ear there anyway, a habit I can't break, and listen to silence that feels earned. And then, once, very softly, somewhere inside the paint, I hear 2 knocks. A pause. 3. You can spackle a hole, you can paint a wall, but you cannot teach your breath to forget being matched by another. And that is how I learned to sleep facing the door, because the wall still answers when I breathe.